Can a team like Ferrari, with all its legacy and resources, continue to stumble upon the same errors again and again? What happened in Singapore was not just a bad day. It was a perfect radiography of the technical and human chaos that the Scuderia lives. And the most serious is that there is no solution in sight. Do you want to know why Ferrari is trapped in his own maze? Then stay, because what you are to see will leave you thinking. The free practice session 1 of the Singapore Grand Prix began with a feeling of relief in the Ferrari garage. After weeks of frustrations, the stopwatch seemed to take a break. Charles Leclerc was second in the timetable and Lewis Hamilton fourth, which generated a wave of moderate optimism inside and outside the team. But reality, as happens so many times in Formula One, was far from what the times showed. Ferrari's performance in FP1 was a carefully constructed illusion, product of a technical strategy that prioritized the appearance on the substance. From the first turn, Ferrari used a more aggressive motor map than its main rivals. This means that they released more power from the propeller to achieve competitive times in the short term, sacrificing the most representative data collection for career. While Red Bull and McLaren focused their batches on stint simulations with heavy fuel loads and conservative motor modes, Ferrari sought immediate impact. This type of strategy is not new in Maranello. In previous seasons, there had already been a tendency to hide the structural deficiencies of the car with disguised classification batches. But on this occasion, the maneuver was even more risky due to the thermal and technical context of the Marina Bay circuit. The urban layout of Singapore is one of the most demanding calendar, with constant traction areas, low-speed curves, and an irregular asphalt that penalizes balance errors. In this type of configuration, it is easy to artificially inflate performance in a short batch, but it is extremely difficult to sustain that level in real career conditions. In fact, telemetry data revealed that Ferrari achieved its best records in specific sectors where the mechanical traction of the SF-25 can shine, especially in the closed curves of Sector 2. However, in the areas of greater average speed and more open curves, the loss of time against McLaren and Red Bull was constant. This was not visible in a final timetable, but it was exposed in the paths of the intermediate sectors. Even more worrying was the analysis of tire wear. Although Leclerc marked a competitive time, he did it at the expense of an excessive temperature in the rear tires, which reached critical levels after only 3 laps thrown. This pattern had already been repeated in other races of the year and in the preseason tests, but in Singapore it was exacerbated. The heat and extreme humidity of the environment acted as a multiplier of defects. Instead of cooling the rubbers between turns, the SF-25 punished them even more with each turn. This erratic thermal behavior prevents pilots from building a sequence of consistent turns, which reduces the ability to calibrate the car for classification and career. The contrast with the other teams was evident. While McLaren and Mercedes spent more time working with hard tires and means to simulate different career phases, Ferrari focused their efforts on soft, looking for a quick reference for the timetable. But that information was useless in the long term, since the soft compound would not be used in real career conditions for its extreme degradation. It was an investment of time that generated encouraging headlines, but little useful data. In addition, in the internal plane, it was leaked that the decisions made for FP1 were not agreed between both pilots. Lewis Hamilton preferred a more conservative approach to understand the evolution of SF-25 in extreme heat conditions, but its configuration was modified to align with the strategy of showing a competitive car to the press and sponsors. This generated a slight internal tension, not because of the result itself, but for what it represented. Once again, Ferrari was prioritizing the media narrative over technical preparation. The most disconcerting is that within the team they knew that this performance was not sustainable. The engineers received the first telemetry sheets with contradictory data regarding the evolution of the car on the track. The balance between front and rear load was unstable. Brake temperatures were at the limit. And the simulation estimates for career showed a notable performance drop after the first 10 laps. Despite all that, the illusion remained. Because for a moment, Ferrari reappeared in the top positions, even if it was a fantasy. And thus a mirage was built. FP1 was not a sign of resurrection, but an emotional trap. Singapore, with his night facade and bright lights, exactly reflected the true state of Ferrari. A team that continues to project greatness, but that in the depths, still does not find the way back to the technical truth. The second practical session in Singapore should be the key space for Ferrari to put in context its apparent advances of the FP1. A batch that, for being held in conditions more similar to those of the race, the lowest environment, more stable moisture, and configuration of artificial lights as on Sunday, has always been considered the true measure of the competitive state of each team. But what happened to the Scuderia in FP2 was a raw and without filter exposure of its structural disorder, an operational disaster in slow chamber that exposed not only technical limitations, but deep internal management failures. It all started with an environment already rarely. From the first runway, both Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton reported by radio severe balance problems. The SF-25, which during the first practice had been configured with an aggressive motor map and low fuel load, now faced more realistic conditions and the car collapsed. Hamilton could barely complete a decent batch before violently touching the wall in Curve 7, causing a momentary loss of rhythm and trust. The incident was lower in terms of material damage, but revealing in how the car does not allow error margins, even for a 7-time world champion. Meanwhile, on the other side of the box, Leclerc was the protagonist of an even more worrying incident. In full practice, when he returned to boxes after an average batch, he was unsafe in the pit lane directly in the trajectory of Lando Norris. The result was an avoidable clash that damaged the front wing of the McLaren and forced a momentary red flag. This type of error, unforgivable at this level of competition, not only presented failures in the pit wall coordination, but also generated an immediate reaction from the FIA, which announced an unsafe liberation investigation. The images toured the paddock in seconds, a Ferrari interrupting in McLaren in one of the most monitored areas of the circuit. But the most disconcerting was yet to happen. What followed was a symbolic scene of the organizational collapse of the Scuderia. Several mechanics from Ferrari, in an attempt to collaborate, helped push the McLaren damaged back to their garage. A sports gesture without a doubt, but also brutally reflected the loss of tactical identity of the team. It was difficult not to interpret it as a visual metaphor of a team that no longer distinguishes between rivals, protocols, or priorities. Internally, the action was received with an annoyance by the coaching staff, which interpreted the gesture as a lack of absolute focus in full simulation session. The consequences of this chaos were multiple. First, Ferrari wasting valuable time on the track by adjusting the configurations of the two cars. Second, the session was fractured in terms of data collection. Third, the atmosphere inside the garage became even more tense. While the engineers tried to rebuild the arguments planned with alternative configurations, the technical team was forced to respond to the commissioners, interrupting the collective concentration. And out of cameras, internal discussions were reported on decisions taken by pit wall during practice. It was not an open crisis, but a new structural misalignment symptom. But beyond the punctual incident, which truly sank Ferrari in FP2, was the inability to adapt to the progressive changes of the layout. As the track gumped and the conditions improved, rival teams showed progression. Mercedes, McLaren, and Red Bull managed to find tenths by return as the track temperature dropped. Ferrari, on the other hand, got worse. Each posterior stunt through more erratic times. The wear of the rear tires shot, the temperatures of the front axle became impossible to manage, and the speed differential in average curves exceeded 7 km/h compared to the reference rhythm. The SF-25 simply did not respond. And the most alarming was the reading of the simulator. The correlation between virtual data and real behavior was completely broken. Ferrari not only did not know how to solve his problems, he didn't understand where they came from. This type of disconnection between simulator and reality is critical in modern Formula One. It means that even when the team believes to be doing things correctly, the car does not react as it should. There is no worse enemy in this category than a development tool that does not represent what happens on the track. The session ended with Ferrari further from the leadership than at the beginning of the day. And the most worrying thing is that it was not for lack of talent or for bad luck. It was due to basic errors in the execution of operations, for structural failures in communication, and by a technical platform unable to evolve on the march. In FP2, Ferrari was not a tip team struggling to find rhythm. It was an overflowing organization, exposed to the world, unable to execute even the foundations. And the pilots cannot cover those cracks for much longer. Lewis Hamilton, with all his experience, can maximize what the car has, but cannot invent speed where there is no. Charles Leclerc, emotionally committed to the project, cannot continue loading with the expectations of an entire nation without real technical support. None of them, however brilliant, can convert a badly conceived car in a winning weapon. It's not about will, it's about structure. Ultimately, Singapore was not the beginning of a crisis. It was the most recent chapter of a story that has been without a decent conclusion too many years. The real challenge for Ferrari is not to find a 10th in classification, but on building a team that does not depend on isolated miracles to compete.